Okay, I think this presentation is going to be a little bit different from the other ones you've had today, because I don't work in the world of house building or housing supply, but I've been asked to give a kind of overview of some of the drivers of the housing affordability crisis, and so that's what I'll do. I'm just going to, for the ease of structure, divide the issues into demand-side issues and supply-side issues. And before I get into the meat, I just want to point out that when I say demand-side issues, I really am talking about demand and not need. And I think it's really important that we distinguish housing demand from housing need. The reason I say that is because if prices were shaped by the balance between supply and need, then prices would have been falling for most of the last 30 years. This graph here, the red line, shows the surplus of houses. That's the left-hand axis there. So if you take the total number of houses, you subtract the total number of households, it's that proportion of the housing stock which is surplus to actual need. That, as you can see, was growing, right? All the blue line is average house price. That surplus was growing right until the height of the housing boom. Okay? So, and we also know that in places like Ireland and Spain and parts of the US, often when there's huge increases in construction in the early 2000s, that did nothing to prevent house prices surging. So if you look at the data, shortages and the balance between housing supply and housing need cannot explain the timings and the scale of the booms and busts that we see in the housing system. Yes, of course, this housing surplus has been falling in recent years, but compared to other OECD countries, the UK has the average number of homes per capita. We've got a comparable amount of housing as you know, the Netherlands, Hungary, Canada, and many more than many other much more affordable places. So, and in fact, the government's own house price model shows that just building more houses wouldn't solve the housing crisis. So the economist Ian Mulhern looked at the government's own econometrician calculations. They crunched the data. They've calculated the sensitivity of house prices to changes in supply. And Ian took those figures and calculated what would have happened to house prices had we built 300,000 homes every year since 1995. The answer that he found is that prices would only be about 7% cheaper. So, and that's possible because demand is not the same thing as housing need. So it's actually perfectly feasible for supply to keep up with housing need, but for supply to keep up with housing demand would take insane amounts of building that would have disastrous environmental consequences. So we need to look at what is fueling the really inflated and unsustainable levels of demand in the market at the moment. So as I try and illustrate here, demand is shaped not by the number of buyers, which includes people who want somewhere to live, but also by second homeowners and landlords. It's shaped by the strength of preference, which is like how desperate are people to win this bid? Would they be happy to stay in the private rented sector, for example? And how much purchasing power do they have at their disposal? Because your desire to buy somewhere is only effective demand if you've got the purchasing power to back it up. And when most people go to buy a house, they're not using existing money that they have in their savings account. What are they doing? They're taking out a massive whopping mortgage. And hopefully, as many of you will know by now, the way our monetary system works is that when banks lend you money for a mortgage or for a car or whatever, they're not taking existing savings from someone else and giving them to you. They're creating new money through the alchemy of double entry bookkeeping. They're typing a number into a computer screen and creating new money. So the upshot of that is that if you have processes of massive deregulation of the banking system, you have falling interest rates, so it's cheaper to get credit. You have much more risky lending, higher loan-to-income ratios, and so on. What you're getting is basically masses of new money being pumped into the housing system. This graph demonstrates that. So the grey chunk there is mortgages as a proportion of bank lending. You can see how dramatically that rose compared, for example, to lending for productive businesses, which has shrunk to that green line there at the top. I think it's about 13% of bank lending now. This is from a report by Positive Money. And you can see how tightly correlated the increase in bank lending is with house prices. So that's kind of one of the key drivers of demand, this massive expansion in the purchasing power available to buyers in the housing market. It's, yes, having falling interest rates, having cheaper loans, for example, having the Help to Buy products. It might help those people who are literally going to get their mortgage on that day, slightly lower interest rate. Great, I can afford to borrow a little bit more. But if everybody is standing on tiptoes, nobody gets a better view, right? You're all just able to bid that little bit more, and the prices go up and up. So the second key change in policy that's driven a frenzy of demand in the housing system is, of course, the deregulation of tenants' rights and the various tax breaks and financial products for landlords. So since the mid-90s, landlords have outbid millions of first-time buyers and trapped millions of people in the private rented sector. I use the word trapped very, very deliberately because surveys are very clear that only 6% of people want to live in the private rented sector, and half of them only want to be there for a couple of years. So, this massive leap in the proportion of the housing stock from 10% being owned by landlords to 20% being owned by landlords, that wasn't driven by demand from people wanting to live in private rented accommodation, as I'm sure any of you who live in the PRS will know from first-hand experience. That frenzy of buy-to-let demand was, as I say, driven by the availability of buy-to-let mortgages, which basically, for those who don't know, a buy-to-let mortgage allows you don't have to prove that you can pay back the mortgage from your own income, which of course is what most ordinary buyers have to do. If you're getting a buy-to-let mortgage, you can just show that the rental income is enough to cover the mortgage interest costs. That means that landlords can get interest-only products much more easily than the rest of us. So it gives them a massive advantage in the market. Tax breaks, of course, also landlords benefited from mortgage interest tax relief, which ordinary buyers don't get. That's where you get to offset the interest from your tax bill. Wear and tear allowance, when they didn't have to show that they'd spent anything on wear and tear, etc., etc. So some of these tax breaks have been tightened up in recent years, but a little bit too late to stem the massive flow of money from landlords into the market. We're still getting about £8 billion of new mortgage lending flowing to landlords every year. And then, of course, there's the dismantling of tenants' rights. So from 1915 to 1989 in the UK, we had rent controls, as was common across Europe, and it still is today. There's about 17 countries across Europe that still have rent controls in place. Thatcher dismantled those rent controls and also sort of introduced these short-term lets. So across most of Europe, the landlord doesn't have an automatic right to kick you out. As long as you haven't broken the terms of the tenancy agreement, you have some protections against being evicted for no reason. We don't have that in the UK, and that's extremely anomalous compared to everywhere else. So yeah, all of this made landlord investment much more attractive, as well, finally, as the prospect of making capital gains. I'll come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to say a little bit more about rent controls. I just recently read this paper by Eichholz and colleagues who show that, this is showing real rent prices, by the way, adjusted for inflation, across these major European cities. And they show that it was rent controls which drove the affordability revolution in these 4 cities. And you can see those big improvements in rent affordability happened specifically at the times when rent controls were tightest. Namely, because they were quite simplistic rent control models. We can do rent controls in a much more sophisticated way these days, but they were quite simple models where they just froze the rent at nominal levels. Meanwhile, they had high levels of inflation in those periods. And so the rents were really tightly controlled, effectively. And so they show that, housing inequality and housing affordability grew massively during the 20th century, largely because of the implementation of rent controls. And then I just wanted to mention a bit more about the prospect of capturing capital gains. An analysis by Positive Money showed that the value of private rented properties in England has increased by over £400 billion. That's more wealth than the GDP of South Africa since the 90s. So that's an absolutely huge, and in fact, the money that can be made through annual increases in the value of property is not only in many years, much higher than what you can earn in a year going out to work, but for landlords, it's actually often higher than what they can earn in rental income. So the way they're making their money has shifted over time. Now, if we had a sensible tax system, it would discourage people from treating homes like speculative assets, because it would tax back these unearned gains and share them out. So, but it doesn't do that. And so, this is the failure to tax unearned windfalls through property is one of the key things that's encouraged people to get into very, very large amounts of debt, levels of debt that would be absolutely mad in other circumstances. But because people believe their properties are going to rise in value, they feel it's a prudent decision. And it is just worth saying that not only is this house price inflation benefiting the already rich, it's also contributing to the persistent and growing inequalities between ethnic groups. This is just showing median house wealth by ethnic group here, very broad crude analysis, but again, there's lots more data on this if you're interested. And again, the failure of our tax property regime has stoked massive demand for second homes and holiday lets. There's a real problem, particularly in coastal areas. This is just a few years out of date now, these figures, but a survey 2-3 years ago showed villages where 2/3 to 95% of properties were second homes. In Cornwall, we did a search, 10,000 properties listed on Airbnb for holiday makers compared to 62 listed on Rightmove for permanent residents. And it's not just the coastal areas. Here's London's Airbnb market quadrupling since 2015, and Edinburgh obviously very much affected too. Second homes in that boom period leading up to the financial crisis, second homes doubled in number in England. So during this period where house prices were going up and up and up, second home ownership. So what can we do about all of these demand side issues? So briefly, because I don't have loads of time, I would argue we need to strengthen tenants' rights. Okay, we should be doing this because it needs doing for its own sake, because people have a right to secure affordable housing. But it would have the beneficial side effect of discouraging so much investment from landlords. I can talk more about rent controls if people are interested, because I'm doing a big modelling project on rent controls at the moment. But we could be using our housing stock much more efficiently, raising council tax on second homes, clamping down on Airbnbs, as I say, taxing away unearned windfalls from investors. We can help local authorities and community groups to buy the homes that are being sold by landlords and investors, and that's really, really important that we manage that process of tenure shift. So we obviously want to shrink the private rented sector and shift those homes over to the social rented sector where they're most urgently needed, and into home ownership as well. That process needs to be managed very carefully, obviously. But this kind of what was called in the 70s the municipalization of the private rented sector, it wasn't just a sort of lefty idea. There was cross-party support for this. So under the Conservatives, tens of thousands of homes were bought by local authorities from the private rented sector, expanding the social rented stock very, very quickly. And we could do that again. There's no reason why we couldn't. Give the Bank of England a target of 0% house price inflation. The Bank of England are given this, 2% target for consumer price inflation, but they seem to be perfectly happy with being allowed to let house prices sometimes raise by double digits. If they had a target for stabilizing house prices, they could reduce a lot of the risky and volatile levels of lending for mortgages. And then there's lots more that needs to be said, to be honest. I've just stuck that in. Obviously, there's lots more that needs to be said about getting rid of the benefits cap and unfreezing local housing allowance and keeping it unfrozen. I just realised that Jeremy Hunt is going to refreeze the housing allowance in due course, which is very bad news. Okay, so just to now move on to supply side issues with the last few minutes. So the problems on the supply side, as I say, shortages of housing can't explain the full affordability crisis, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to build. We obviously do. And before I talk about the dysfunctional land market, I just want to note the whopping scale of land price inflation we've seen. This was ONS figures that came out finally for the first time in 2017, showing the value of land, having residential land increasing by over 550%, massive increase. And that shows the correlation between land prices and house prices, which shouldn't be surprising. This is to do with the way the land market works, and sorry if this is really obvious for you guys. This is probably more your area than mine, but just in case it's not familiar to people, the residual land price model basically works. If you leave the system as it is to private developers to identify land for development and approach landowners, they'll be competing with one another to decide how much to bid for the land. They'll start with a figure at the top for how much they think the finished home can fetch on the open market. Then they'll subtract the costs of building, subtract the costs of contributing to infrastructure and affordable housing. So you can see from this that it's the developers who are most bullish in their expectations of house price growth, who are most willing to compromise on quality and build tiny apartments. It's the ones who are most confident about their ability to wiggle out of their obligations to contribute to infrastructure and affordable housing supply, it's those developers who will win the bid, okay? It's a stupid system that just drives up land prices and drives down quality. And it means that this massive increase in land value that you saw before, that comes from the granting of planning permission is and could be used to fund infrastructure and other public goods, is very, very largely captured by landowners. So it's a crazy system. The second real issue is the under-resourcing of local authorities. So we've had decades of funding cuts, which are illustrated here. This is the number of councils experiencing different levels of funding cuts since 2010. Is absolutely horrific. And so they've also, of course, been unable to set their own planning fees or their own council tax rates and manage their own levels of borrowing. So in most cases, they've withdrawn from the role of active placemaking, and they've just been reduced to this role of approving or rejecting planning applications from private developers and just been reduced to sort of begging for concessions from developers. And even that role is very, very difficult to perform when you're so under-resourced. You've got targets handed down from above, which are based on national demand rather than local need. And so local authorities are just overwhelmingly reliant on developer contributions to meet those targets, and they just quite simply lack the power and resources to drive a hard bargain. So very often we just find local authorities kind of end up bypassing the wishes of local communities and accepting developments and buildings and tenures and amenities that bear very little resemblance to those that communities actually need. And then we could go on and talk about permitted development rights. I'm sure that's already been covered. So we've got this asymmetric power between the planning system and developers, which I've already discussed. But then on top of that, developers are allowed to resubmit their planning applications. And the rights of appeal, which objectors do not possess, just eventually grind down local people's resistance. So I'm kind of going on to why the developments are not reflecting and meeting local needs. And so, yeah, this is just another illustration. I'm sure you've seen this graph showing the absolutely catastrophic sort of collapse of public house building. After by the 1980s. I just wanted to highlight that this recent report by the Competition Markets Authority, which I thought was really interesting to come from that body, hardly a lefty institution. Nevertheless, they highlight that the private market will not, on its own, provide sufficient housing to meet overall housing need, even if it's more competitive than it is now. So they highlight the fact that private firms, they're operating in this flawed business model, and their rate of house building is determined by the market absorption rate. That's how fast they can build out without leading to a fall in house prices. So they're deliberately drip-feeding supply. Of course that's what they're going to do, because if they or their competitors were to build a lot of houses, then prices would fall, their profit margins would fall. That's not in their interests. The private market is never going to build at the scale that we need. So we need to get away from our reliance on this sort of speculative house building model. Okay, and that's it from me on the supply side issues, and I'm so sorry I've kind of run out of time to talk about solutions. Absolutely classic, isn't it? But I could. Really? Do you want that? Yeah. Okay. Well, I can do if it's not going to bore you to tears. I'm just. This is some of the ideas that we went into in our report for the Labour Party in 2019. One of the ideas is to have a new public and democratically accountable development corporation, with the power to purchase, develop, and sell land in the public interest. So they wouldn't replace developers altogether, but they'd act as the prime movers in the land market, working with planning authorities and so on. And they'd be preparing sites for new developments, new towns, garden cities, and urban regeneration projects. Only once the land's been assembled would the development corporations then contract out the construction to the house builders. So the idea is that house builders, and they'd prioritize the small and medium-sized firms, they would be competing with each other on the basis of the quality and the design of the building, rather than competing with each other on the basis of how they can play the land market, which is the case at the moment. So that success and failure would be of private developers would be determined by their construction quality and not their ability to navigate the speculative land market. We also propose reform to the Land Compensation Act. I'm very pleased to say that even the Conservatives have recognised the need for this reform now. Probably many of you will know about this already. I hope I'm...
I'll look into that. I'm sure it's just someone who's pulled the access loop.
Great.
But it should be fine. I'll come in if it's...
Okay. Wow, the lights have come on. That was dramatic. Well, you can, if we all go down in flames, at least we'll know how to solve the housing crisis. The Land Compensation Act, as you might have known, 1961, the whole sort of all those generations of new towns, garden cities, they were built by, they were enabled by the fact that local authorities could go in, buy land at agricultural value, give themselves their own planning permission, and then, and then capture the value uplift and reinvest it in infrastructure and so on. And then, as a result of lobbying by the landowning class, in the 1961 we got the Land Compensation Act, and that basically ended that model completely because it meant that local authorities could no longer buy land at its existing value. They would have to pay the so-called hope value, the value that land would have if it was given planning permission for residential use, and that obviously massively increased the cost of building for public authorities. Okay, I'm sort of sensed I'm probably talking about stuff that many of you already know a lot more about than I do. So I'm going to wrap up and make sure there's a bit of time for other people to answer questions as well. Okay, thanks.